Hi, this is Justin Coletti. You may know me from SonicScoop. Today, I'm with Plugin Alliance and Brainworks, and I'm talking to a fantastic mastering engineer. Really excited for this conversation. It is with a guy named Glenn Schick. Glenn Schick is a mastering engineer who is, I don't want to say breaking all the rules, but making new rules. Glenn Schick has been working on some really major records with some really major artists. A lot of hip-hop stuff like J. Cole, Future, 2 Chainz and Lil Wayne, Gucci Mane, but also, pop and alternative and rock. He's worked with Justin Bieber of Montreal, Elton John, Widespread Panic, Drive-By Truckers, Train, Yoko Ono, Indigo Girls. It just goes on and on. But he's been working on some really amazing, really current hip-hop stuff, pop stuff, rock stuff, and he makes really great sounding records. And Glenn Schick is one of the few guys who is doing this using pretty much completely digital tools. And he even is using headphones for mastering, what people say is a big no-no. But if you listen to Glenn's work, he's clearly making it work. So there's so much I want to ask this guy. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning, Justin. How are you?
All right. Doing great. We are here together on behalf of, big thanks to Plugin Alliance, who's releasing a new mastering EQ for digital systems called the AMEK EQ 200. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I know that Glenn uses so much of the stuff within the Plugin Alliance family and universe as a core in his mastering work, because he is mastering, once again, exclusively digitally, even as a digital nomad. So this is super exciting. Glenn, I am a believer. I've been converted. I'm doing almost all of my mastering digitally now too, and it's amazing to hear someone doing such high-level work with such amazing results doing it. When did this transition start to happen for you from going to a conventional analog digital hybrid mastering system to an all-digital, in-the-box digital nomad mastering setup?
I'd say probably this started around 2011-ish when I first started dipping my toe into this. Mm-hmm. I used to be a trustee for the Grammys. Right. I was living in Atlanta then, and I would fly out to LA a whole bunch of times a year. And, we'd always get some kind of emergency single that would come in and, they would say, Glenn's in LA and he can't do anything for 2 days. And, you can't really jump into somebody else's mastering studio because you learn your room so well. Mm-hmm. So I set up a little laptop with some basic, DAW and a few plugins to say, maybe I could save a job when, those emergency calls came in, and I'd go back to my hotel room and I'll try to, do my best. And it was just with that thought that I set up initially. And I guess when I started hearing the results, and, I was, poster child for analog before, mm-hmm. and never thought in a million years I'd be working in the digital domain exclusively. But, once I started hearing the results and really not only liking it, but sometimes really preferring it, it really made my eyes open to kind of the possibilities. Yeah. So, it's been a good, 6 years, 7 years almost that I've been working like this. So.
I had a similar experience when I switched to mastering digitally. I thought I was going to be found out, and I was just doing a track here or there. And the feedback I got from clients was like, sounds great, fits on the rest of the record, sounds like everything else you send us. Did you get similar feedback, or was there a significant learning curve for it?
Well, what's really fascinating, I think, is that, all the guys, especially, mastering in its kind of, heyday, when people started really noticing mastering engineers, I'd say probably like late 80s, early 90s when CDs were all getting remastered. A lot of that stuff was done on Weiss digital gear. Yeah. And, I used Daniel Weiss's stuff and some other digital equipment with my analog stuff, even when I had that. So, I don't think it's really a surprise that digital sounds good and has sounded good. It's just we live in our guild, our profession is romantic. Mm-hmm. And just like people love old cars and, they say, oh, that's 69 Chevelle, man, that would be the car I'd love to have. But if you want to talk about what drives better and what's actually the better performing vehicle and whatever, a new vehicle is going to, you put a Tesla next to a Chevelle and it looks like a relic.
It's a joke, yeah. The Tesla's doing like 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds or something now. But even like I drive a fairly humble car. It's like a recent model Chevy Malibu, but even that thing smokes like sports cars from 50 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, we're the last people to kind of fess up and say, it's really a romantic thing about loving all this old analog gear, which some of it's great, but a lot of it's just romanticism. So.
Right. Well, some of it does have a real character, and when you want to bring that character into your productions, fortunately, there are companies like Plug-in Alliance who are doing like the restoration and, bringing back the old 69 Mustang you always wish you had, and now you can have a, digital version of it. And they're probably one of the companies best doing that, I think, taking like real legit modeling of the old school stuff. Because every once in a while you want to do a photo shoot, and that photo shoot has to have a 64 Mustang in it, right? And every once in a while you want to master a record, and it has to have, the Fairchild or the SSL compressor or whatever it is. So it's good that someone is recreating those, and Plug-in Alliance is doing a fantastic job of that, as well as some of the totally digital tools like the BX stuff. But we'll get into that later. The first thing I want to talk about before we talk about the specific tools you use to make sounds, is I want to talk about what's on your head. We've both got our Princess Leia look going on. Yours are really big ones because they are really good ones. I have tried those headphones. I think they're like $4,000 headphones or something like that. Can you tell us a little bit about that brand of headphones, how long it took you to get into using it, and what's been like transitioning from mastering on speakers to mastering pretty much exclusively on headphones?
Not pretty much exclusively. Exclusively. I haven't used a pair of speakers on the regular in 5 years. Wow. And people are sometimes taken aback by it, but I'll let the results speak for themselves. And I'm a firm believer that the human brain is kind of an incredible machine and very malleable. The big thing, I think, from going from a room and speakers and learning the acoustics of your room to having your brain trained for a binaural experience with headphones, it's just a matter of time and retraining. And I started initially with in-ears, and I used several different in-ears, and I tried to even like pull some apart and remake them. And I have a whole drawer full of multi-driver in-ear that I tried initially, and it worked. And I was initially not a fan of the idea of headphones because I thought open back headphones and, I'm working in all these environments and I kind of wanted more isolation. But I had a friend of mine who's a producer in the UK, and he kept raving about, these headphones and we have very similar taste and stuff. When he says, I like this, I go, oh, I like that too. And he said, for some reason, this headphone setup felt on to him, like it was true. And, so I grabbed a pair of these. These are Audeze, is the company out of Southern California. I grabbed a pair of these, and I also work with a very good company out of the UK called Chord Electronics. Mm-hmm. So I got a really good DAC and amp, and I got the headphones, and I think one can't forget about that part of the equation as well, because it's not just headphones to get something to your head. But, I found myself really loving it, and especially the things that I couldn't really kind of judge so well without my room before, like bass. I had no problem with these. And, it's just been a joy, and I recreate that same environment every time I put these on, and there's no the room sounds a little different today. The humidity is a little different. It doesn't quite sound the same. Mm-hmm. I have a very repeatable formula now, and it's way more consistent.
That's wonderful. And, I'm a believer in that too. I have some Blue headphones here that I've used for mastering on the road, getting a track while I'm not at the studio. and I'm able to do the same thing that you're talking about, just having trained my brain to hear so many records through it. But the important thing is, like you found a pair of headphones that actually reproduces low frequency below 100 hertz in a meaningful way. And that's going to be a challenge. So you still have to get the right headphones for the job. It's probably not just any headphones. So you've got to
It's not any headphones for sure. Yeah. I think that there's plenty of choices nowadays.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'd love to play around with those more. I have heard them at trade shows, put them on, and wanted to run home with them because it's hard to justify spending that much on headphones. But then again, you compare it to how much people would spend on mastering grade speakers, and it's a drop in the bucket.
I had, $100,000 speakers in my old studios, and that's not even including the amplification and things like that. And, I feel like I've made no compromise now. So
wonderful. I totally believe you. And I say the quality of your work speaks for itself. And for anyone who doesn't agree, go listen to some of these records. They sound as good as any other mastered records out there. And we know that Glenn turns it around fast and professionally. So I'm really keen on hearing some of your insights on exactly what you use and how you do it. The last thing I want to say in the speakers headphones thing before we get to it, the only thing where I'd have trouble myself transitioning to only headphones is that to me, speakers can be a little bit more fun. What do you say to that? The idea of having speakers in there, moving air with you, multiple people in a room listening together. What do you say to that? That one huge defense speakers still have in a great room is fun.
It's fun to get naked in a pool too, I'm sure. And, there's trade-offs. I mean, sure. It's a nice experience being unencumbered in a room that's comfortable, that's been designed and tuned well for something. But I've lived in 7 countries and, traveled all over the world, and my studio wasn't going to get me that.
That's fun too. The fact that you lived, if I remember correctly, you lived for a while in Iceland and Thailand, was it South Korea? And that's fun too, being able to travel the world mastering records and be a nomad in that way. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of, the big sellers and hits coming out of the studio were done in an Airbnb, overlooking a river in South Korea, or, just kind of not what you'd expect. So.
Yes. Well, so the fun factor is definitely there. And also, like we said, in defense of the headphones, you're going to get into a premium, super premium headphone system much less expensively than you're going to treat out a room and make speakers in room work, phenomenally well. But no matter what it is, you've got to learn it. Speaking of learning it, I want to learn from you, Glenn. What are some of your favorite tools that you use, and what is your approach and process that you use? So first, I want to ask you about approach and process. Do you have like a kind of standard order of operations, like I EQ first, or I listen to, other records in the genre first, or I hit my compressors first? Is there kind of a path that you often take through a mastering job?
I think, it's evolved over the years for sure. I think earlier on my career when I've been doing this like 27 years now, just the mastering part, and was a mix engineer before. So earlier in my career, I would use things like references. And, if I was doing a hip hop record, I'd go grab my favorite hip hop records and take a listen to them and try to kind of get them to match a little bit. Mm-hmm. But as I've evolved, I stopped doing references anymore. Mm-hmm. And I tend to just kind of listen to what was brought to me first and see what they did with it. So the first thing, I guess, would be to see, is this a great recording? Do I not need to mess with this? Mm-hmm. Is this a recording that suffered from some issues? Do I need to kind of adjust this or address this? Or do I need to even go back and tell the client he needs to go back to the mixer or recording engineer or producer and address this? Because not everything can be addressed in mastering.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. And knowing the difference between the two is huge. I've heard projects ruined much more often from a mastering engineer doing too much than not doing enough. You're more likely to ruin something, right, by doing things that you shouldn't be doing than to you're not going to ruin something by doing too little. You're just not going to take it all the way it could go. So I think that's huge. And that's something I respect about mastering engineers who've been doing it for a while. They know when to lay back. And I guess your headphones so well now, you've heard so many different records through them again and again, day after day, that you can kind of put them on, fire up, and have a good sense for where things are sitting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So once you've made those judgments, just listening to it, listening to how it came in, what's your next step from there? I mean, obviously it's going to vary to a degree depending on projects, but do you often start with EQ, often start with compression, limiting, spatialization? Is there a certain tool you usually grab first? What's that like?
It's absolutely EQ, and EQ is generally going to be the most, the least, I should say, damaging when used in its proper way. And I want to do the least amount of harm. My motto is serve the music. And it doesn't serve the music, like you said, to kind of blow it out with all kinds of processing and things like that. So my first thing is to see how the music responds to some, gentle EQ usually. I don't do anything major unless it's really out of whack. But, there'll be some gentle EQ and just see how I massage the first, round with a little bit of EQ and see, what comes out from there, because a lot of times there'll be something hiding behind something else. And when you EQ, then you can find something new has just poked out of the mix, and really something you didn't know you even had to address. So your first phase of EQ can be just kind of uncovering what's underneath the mix, right, and, seeing if you have problematic stuff.
Absolutely. I've noticed the same thing in mastering, that particularly some of the low-end cleanup that maybe I'd have to do on, 80% of projects, maybe need some type of low-end cleanup. That once you've done that, you're creating a bump somewhere further up in the upper mids or high frequencies that now all of a sudden, it's like any move you do to the low end kind of has almost like a corresponding effect in the upper mids or the high end and vice versa. So I totally get what you mean. Would you say that filters are also part of the process? I know you're working on a lot of hip hop records that have a lot of big bottom on them. And I know that traditionally mastering engineers have used a lot of kind of low frequency filtering, particularly on rock and pop projects to tighten things up. Does the role of a low filter and low frequency processing, is it considerably different on hip hop records?
I don't want to specifically single out hip hop so much, but in general, I don't tend to do a lot of filtering especially in hip hop or anything for that matter, unless there's a problem again. Because most of the engineers, especially the better ones and really competent engineers, have already done a bunch of, high pass filters or things like that on their stuff. And, I don't really find too much stuff with like super rumbly low end that's, just kind of a problem. I'd be more likely on like a classical piano thing to do some kind of high pass filter to get rid of some rumble on the bottom or something. But on a hip hop record, if the bass is good, let it live.
Yeah. And I think a big part of also what you're talking about is a difference in the levels of mixes that certain mastering engineers might be working on, and also a change in the availability of better low-end listening environments than in the past. I mean, decades ago, when the majority of people who were mixing even at a pro level weren't necessarily mixing on great systems with lots of low-end, maybe that the filtering was a big part of the process then, because even mixing engineers, pros, couldn't hear that stuff. And now today, those people who are mastering records that maybe aren't at the level that you aren't getting the same quality of mixes in that you're getting. And the quality of the mix is a big deal in the quality of the master, isn't it?
Absolutely. But, we also do a ton of, independent. And, one of our main things we've done over the years is encourage up and coming and even amateur engineers to send in stuff before they're ready to get their stuff mastered, so we can give it a quick listen and tell them, there's problems in this area. This is something you probably should work on. Right. And we try to make it like a cooperative process with our mix engineers and to try to make this something that everybody likes.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I'm curious, do you ever do any kind of stem mastering, or do you really try to keep it all stereo all the time?
I am not a big fan of stem mastering.
I feel the same way.
Not my thing. I firmly believe that stem mastering is mixing.
Yeah, I agree.
And, I'm not the guy that wears the mixer badge. I know how to mix, but that's not my forte. And I don't want to make mix decisions in the mastering room. And it's just as simple as that. So
I hear you. I generally, when I feel like there's something that could be fixed from stems, I'm generally recommending the mixer do that, because in a way you're helping them become a better mixer, right? By giving them the feedback, by hearing it on this system that you know so well, and then giving them the pointers. It's so much better if they get there themselves, because then they can get, it's a teach a man to fish thing, right? Instead of fishing for
exactly.
him. Yeah, I think
yep.
that's...
And it's not a big deal to make a phone call and say, hey, I loved your mix, but could you bring the vocal up a little bit?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right, this has been some great big picture stuff. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the tools that you use, the EQs that you use. I know you use a whole bunch depending on the needs of the project. Do you think about EQs existing in like families of EQs, and are there specific EQs that you find yourself coming back to again and again?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's stuff that's just in general more kind of surgical, and the BX, I think it's the V3, has like a lot of parameter adjustment and frequency choices, and lets you work in MS or stereo. So like something like that is, a good like general or surgical EQ, whereas something like, the dangerous backs is more of, those big filters and curves that are on the Baxall EQs are just very different and affect the music in a very different way. So, they all have their place, but they're a very different approach in how you use them.
Right. I'd love to dive in just a little bit further into those two specific EQs, because there's a lot under the hood in them and some concepts that I don't want to assume that everyone listening knows and understands. So that first one you mentioned, the BX, was it V3 EQ? BX is Brainworks. It's one of the Plug-in Alliance brands, and they make a whole bunch of stuff that really is geared towards mastering and doing things that really only digital tools can do. And that all those BX mastering plugins are in that vein. This one, not only having just a ton of control over several bands, was one of the innovators in kind of mid-side processing for mastering digitally. In what cases do you find yourself using mid-side processing? First, in your own words, what is mid-side processing? And secondly, how do you find yourself using that kind of approach in mastering?
Well, mid-side, from what my knowledge of it was originally a microphone technique, and separated your panned information with what's sitting in the center of your stereo mix. While it was originally a mic technique, from what I know, in mastering, we use it because in the side information, there's a lot of things that live there other than instruments. So, for instance, in the side information, you're going to hear things like reverbs, you're going to hear echo, you're going to hear hard panned instruments, which you don't hear in the center. And those things can be problematic in a master, just like anything else could be. So if I need to work on a really boomy reverb or something, I'd probably want to work in a mid-side EQ.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then the Bax EQ from Dangerous. I believe this is something you owned back in your analog days. Is that right? You owned the analog version? And this
I had several of them in the studio.
So. Oh, wow. All right.
Yeah.
That's a compliment to them. And this is one of, again, ones in the Plug-in Alliance family that are developed by Plug-in Alliance. And it's one of those emulations of a analog hardware piece a lot of people loved for mastering, for how smooth it was. Can you give me a sense, A, for how it compares to the analog hardware you were used to, and B, what is a Baxendale EQ, and why would you reach for one of those over a more surgical, conventional EQ?
First of all, I think the emulation that they did, or the plug-in version compared to the analog, it's so on the money. I've heard some things, and I used to live with those dangerous EQs 24/7, and like I said, we had, I think, 3 or 4 of them in my old studio, and we used those on stereo projects, on surround sound projects. It's just a great EQ. The plugin is spot on, just spot on.
Sweet. And then can you give us a little bit of a sense for those who don't know the concept behind this? I always hope I'm saying it right. Baxandal. I think that's how you say it. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. Is it Bandaxel? Is it Baxandal? Man, it's one of those things you see written so many times and then you never pronounce that loud. So one of those was right, one of those was wrong. You people tell me in the comments below exactly how I should pronounce it. Next, I'm going to see if I can get Bloomline right. But anyway, this type of EQ, how do you use it and what makes it different from a more conventional or more surgical EQ?
Well, I mean, you're dealing with like big sweeping filter type EQs. It's not a conventional parametric EQ where you'd have like width of your bands and your frequencies that you select. This is some preset frequencies in high and low that basically you can do different curves. And from what I understand, those curves have little frequency bumps depending on the frequency that you've selected that really change the character of things. So you can use them in, a lot of different ways. They can tighten up the low end. They can warm up your top end, get rid of some harshies. Mm-hmm. It just depends on the application, but they have several really good applications. And they're very musical as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I've used them, and they're just super smooth. Now, before I go on to asking a little bit more about dynamic range control, compression, limiting, loudness, all that good stuff, any other EQs you want to shout out that are things that come up a lot or have special uses that are just
sure.
around?
As far as other EQs, I like sometimes when I'm using MS stuff, I like the BX Pan, which is actually I love the GUI on it, and it kind of visually lets you see the stereo field and kind of play with the MS EQ in a way that you get a real visual feedback of what's going on too, and that's fun when I'm working in some MS stuff. I like, I'm just trying to think of some of the other goodies. Their new EQ, that AMEK, is really nice.
Oh, yeah.
I use different things sometimes, some for color and some for precision. So
yeah, let's talk about that for a second since we're on the EQ topic. The AMEK EQ 200, which is one of the reasons we're having this conversation, is an EQ that was modeled after a Massenburg EQ, I believe the GML 8200, which was one of those first parametric EQs out there that really changed the genre of EQs. And those Massenburg and the Sontec EQs were probably some of the most popular EQs in high-end mastering going forward for another, 40 or so years after they were made. So why do you think that those types of EQs are still relevant and coveted today as pieces of analog hardware? And why are they still relevant today in the digital domain?
So I think there's a couple things that really, are relevant about those. The guys who designed it, George Massenburg and Burgess, those guys not only were engineers, but George is an amazing audio engineer and, musical as well. Mm-hmm. So when he designed the 8200 and his 9500 later, they were done with the thought of making music, not just crunching numbers and, getting the cleanest THD and all that, although they're super clean too. But I think the biggest thing was that he wanted to not hurt the music. And those things are very, very transparent. The reason people like, 8200s and 432 Sontecs are because they're very transparent and they don't really hurt the music. So I think that's probably why they're still so popular.
Yeah, and I think there's a degree of the kind of curation almost of specific frequency points or specific bandwidths. Obviously, you can adjust frequency points and adjust bandwidths, but they're selected by people, like you said, who have been in the studio making records and who are selecting the kind of defaults for bandwidth and frequency selection spots that made sense to them. So having something that's a little bit curated rather than so open-ended, just as like a graphical modern EQ, I can see the attraction to that. What kinds of applications have you been finding the AMEK, the new one? I know you've just been using it for a few weeks now, but in the short time you've had to use it, what have been some of the applications where you're finding it the most useful?
There's a bunch of things. I've actually got it up behind me here.
Nice.
First of all, it's super, super flexible. It's not just an 8200 clone. It's way more than that. And some of the things that I really dug on it, do you mind me turning my back on you?
Yeah, that's fine. We can still hear you.
So some of the things that I really love about it, besides the 5 bands that you have here, and you have low pass and high pass filters, you also have a great MS matrix built in here. So besides the 5 bands, you also have low pass, high pass filters. You have this stereo width, which is it has a lot of MS features where you can split the EQ up MS, and especially with MS stuff, because it's sometimes hard to hear things. There's a great audition feature on here called Auto Listen, where you can actually hear just what you're sweeping or frequencies you're selecting. And it also has some character stuff, which the original 8200 didn't really have. So some of the things, they're TMT here, which basically, from what I understand, takes, you can randomize stuff where you could actually have like a slightly different EQ for left and right if you wanted to kind of make it less sterile, or if you wanted to change like a console channel, you could change it to a different console channel. So with the modeling that they've done, it makes it much more than just kind of a stock 8200 clone. It's really quite a versatile EQ, and they have all those great preset frequencies, but you can also vary any of those frequencies to what you want as well, so you're not limited to that. And the other thing that I personally love about this one, a lot of times you'll set up an EQ curve, something you really like, and it just feels a little too little or a little too much. And there's a great feature here called gain scale. And with gain scale, you can actually just, if you have, I don't know, a smiley face curve, and you gain scale, it'll just lessen things or increase things. And if you have something complex with, 6 moves on it that you want to try a little less of or a little more of in percentages of how much EQ applied, it's great.
I love that idea. You can just kind of go a little bit too far to make sure you're really going in the right direction and then scale back on all of it at once. It's a really intuitive way to work. And I have found myself using EQs that don't do that. And they have to go in and be like, all right, okay, well, if I want to tuck this back by 20%, what's 20% of 2.3 dB and what's 20% of 1.3 dB? And it does it all for you. So wonderful. Really great function to have. Thanks for giving us a little tour of the AMEK EQ 200. I'm super excited to try this out even deeper myself. I've only had access to it for a short time too, but it is, it feels like a pristine piece of analog gear. Now, speaking of tools, I would love to get a little bit more. We've covered a lot of EQ. I'd love to get a little bit more of your taste around compression and limiting. Do you lean more on compression or more on limiting in your work? And do you have any favorites or different categories that you think of in that world of dynamic range control for mastering?
I think there's a lot of stuff that certainly people like. Myself, I tend to use compressors more as coloration than actual compression. So if I throw a compressor on something, it's usually for the color of that compressor. If you're going to use like a tube compressor or something like that, to kind of give you a different tone, with really no active compression going through, just kind of passing through. Sometimes those things will add a nice character to music when you're working on it. And limiting, it's a necessary evil for some stuff, but I try to do the least amount for all those things I can. So I think a record I did a couple of years ago, a J. Cole record, people were kind of shocked that it had so much dynamic range on it for a hip hop record. And, I didn't really do so much compression or limiting on that. And so that may not be the loudest record that you've ever heard, but it'll sure knock down some doors when it kicks in. So
yeah, good stuff, man. Do you find yourself more often when you're using compression and limiting using single band, or do you have any place for multi-band in your world? And if so, under what circumstances?
I think there certainly are some multiband that you can do and use, but that gets into some very dangerous territory. It's really, really easy to whack out a mix when you start doing some multiband stuff. The crossovers tend to not keep your stuff as pristine when you're dealing with the crossovers on some of those items. Some are better than others. But I try to do the least amount that I need to. So, if I'm pulling out a multiband, it's because something's got some problems.
I totally agree. It's almost for me a step between stem mastering and regular mastering, where it's like I'm going in to fix a problem in the mix, and is that better resolved with a phone call to the mixer? And maybe to a degree, it depends on, the capabilities of that mixer. But if you're working with really competent people, to some degree, it's useful to tell them, hey, here's a thing that, I'm going to have to use a multi-band to control these hi-hats or this kick or this bass or whatever it is. But if you were to tweak that in the mix, then we can get even better results and I won't have to touch the thing. So I can see how that approach that you have really makes sense in that context. So wonderful. For those single band compressors and limiters you use, any favorite names you want to throw out there for color compressors or anything else that you find yourself coming back to again and again?
Sure. I like the Shadow Hills. It's kind of a nice piece for coloration and things like that. I use some, I'm trying to think of some other ones. Sometimes I'll try to get some vintage recreations of some plugs and things like that. So, some older, opto compressors or, Fairchildy stuff or, things that kind of just have a specific character that I can throw in there. And that's very project dependent. I don't mean to be kind of a generalist about that, but it just really has to be the right thing for the right project.
Are there any other analog compressors that you owned back in the day that have been recreated like by Plug-in Alliance, like that Bax EQ was? Was it the Alpha compressor that you owned at one point? Were there any others in that world?
I used to use the Music EQ, the Elysia, and they did a great also recreation on that. And I've used the analog Elysia compressor as well, and it's a beast. And the plug is very similar in that respect. So.
Yeah, got it. Cool stuff. And then some last quick ideas here on the vibe of kind of spatialization, stereo spreading or any other additional ancillary effects, whether they're saturation or spatialization. Any favorite things you use there or any particular way that you think about using those two things, either saturation or stereo spreading?
Sure. I think I do both of those things sometimes. And, certainly something like a vitalizer, like SPL's vitalizer is really good for like giving you a little more, spatial depth in your master. And that's something I use occasionally. And, working in MS sometimes will open up the space as well. And you can enhance and change the balance in MS. And what's the other? Oh, for saturation and things. The SPL also does saturation, but like they have that VSM3, which also is a really good saturator as well. And, that also does a nice job.
Right. That's the Vertigo VSM3. It's kind of both a compressor saturator, I think, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you played around at all with a Black Box, the HG guy?
I actually really like the Black Box too. The Black Box I love to use to really kind of beef up some bottom occasionally, and it's really, really good at that.
Yeah, that one's beautiful. One quick question for you, because the Shadow Hills kind of has like a saturation-y thing to it, that compressor. It has those two different compressor modes in it. Is it discrete and optical? Can you tell me anything about your approach to using that compressor? Because there's such complexity in it that can seem daunting to people at first if you really go into the hood. But it's also one of those things you just kind of put it up and it sounds good. Just tweak one knob until you get more or less compression. It sounds good. But there's so much you can do under the hood with different types of compressors. Can you give me your thought process about using that one at all, the Shadow Hills?
I think, with that or any other compressor for that matter, you're talking about what the transformers and other things did in the signal path. And like I said, I don't really use compression to compress things so much. So a lot of that character I'm not as concerned about as much as what like a transformer in the line would sound like. And, that was the main thing in my analog studio that I really missed when I had digital setup the first time, was that I was missing those transformers.
Yeah.
And now there's just a bunch of options to get that transformer sound back. So.
Right. And there's a lot of big mastering engineers who I know have a similar approach to that. Greg Calby, another one of my favorites. He'll, patch something in and say, does it sound better or worse with this not doing anything? And then patch something else. And you can take that same approach like you do now to digital stuff, particularly with stuff like the Plugin Alliance stuff, where it's modeling these old transformer items where so many of these plugins have a vibe before they start doing anything. And that's true of even like their more, tracking stuff. Like you put that purple compressor they have on a vocal or a bass and it has a sound before there's any compression. And same thing with the Shadow Hill, same thing with so many of these EQs you're talking about, which is wonderful to have. Hey, last couple quick questions for you. One of them is, a couple of times you said, when we help our clients. I'm wondering if it's the royal we or if you work with an assistant as your kind of digital nomad self. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Do you have anyone who kind of helps you in the process, and what's that like working with assistants remotely, if that is the case for you?
So nobody else masters anymore. I used to have, I had some very big facilities in Atlanta back in the day. And, I had several engineers who are all doing well on their own now. Now it's just me, and I have an office who's, my guy in Atlanta who's still there. I'm currently in Southern California, but, we have been moving constantly. And, he's been with me for like 12 years, and he does all of my scheduling and client interface and, gets everything ready for me. So when I come in the morning, I click on my schedule, I download the files I need to do, and I've got my work day. And then when I'm done, I upload and day's over.
A lot of people who are just getting started in this field don't realize how important that is to really kind of streamline your productivity and your creativity so that all of your brain power is just going into how to make tracks sound better, how to vibe with the music. So I'm so glad you're able to do that. And I'm so glad that you're able to talk to us today, Glenn Schick. This has been so useful for me personally. I'm going to steal so many of your ideas because I hope to be as good of a digital masterer as you as I increase in age. So you're doing terrific work. Really impressed by this stuff, and really impressed by how you've been able to take workflows that worked for you in the analog world, adapt them to the digital world, and make new rules. And I think you are among the first of what I think will be many to come of people who are realizing that there are new and, up until now, unconventional ways to make really great sounding records. Glenn Schick, thanks again so much for joining us. Where would be great places for people to check you out, follow you, hear more from you out there on the web?
We are at the web at www.gsmastering.com or on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at gsmastering, and we're easily reachable anytime.
Good stuff. All right. Big thanks again to Glenn Schick. Thanks to Plugin Alliance and Brainworks for making this conversation possible and for designing that new AMEK EQ 200 plugin that just came out, as well as so many of the other plugins that Glenn was just talking about, whether it's the Elysia stuff, the SPL stuff, the Black Box stuff, the Shadow Hill stuff. I mean, should I go on? There's just so many great models of old analog and EQs, compressors, limiters, as well as some of this new stuff that can really only happen inside the box, like the BX series that's so useful for mastering from Brainworks. And of course, even that analog model stuff like you're talking about, the AMEK EQ 200, there's things it can do that no analog EQ could do, like that kind of gain scaling and stuff like that. So really great features and a really great mastering engineer. Thanks again, Glenn Schick. And thanks to you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.